Hello, my name is Daniel. Welcome to the channel. It is Tag Tuesday, and I have a tag for you today. Tags are not something I normally do on the channel. I haven't done one since the very first video, which I don't recommend watching. It was a little rough, but it's just, for whatever reason, I'm not normally tagged in things, which is fine. But also, I didn't know that on the YouTube app, there's a separate tab for mentions. So apparently I had been tagged in some videos and just never knew it. Blissfully unaware. I would have assumed I would have gotten a message like I do for other comments and stuff, but it didn't happen. So the tag I have for you today is the Bookish A to Z Hot or Not tag. And this was created by Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads. Seen it all over BookTube, but I was actually tagged by my friend Gareth at Book Songs and Other Magic. Just didn't realize it until a little while ago. So apologies, I'm not ignoring you, I just didn't realize. So we have a list of prompts beginning with each of the letters of the alphabet, A through Z, and each one we're supposed to give our gut reaction of whether or not we think this item is hot, which is good, or not, which is just something that leaves us cold. So without further ado, the first one is A, and A is audiobooks. Do I think audiobooks are hot or not? And if you know me at all, or have seen this channel for any period of time, you know that A, audiobooks is something I love. Audiobooks are sort of how I got into reading in the first place. It started with just a love of audio drama in general, radio dramas and things I would get on cassette tapes from the library. And it wasn't until, I think, junior high when I realized that, all this reading I had to do for English class, I could just get the audiobook on cassette. And so I would listen to my books on tape, which is what we used to call them. Now they're just generalized as audiobooks, and they're like a digital file, more or less, unless you still bust out the CDs or some other dedicated device that libraries have. But audiobooks, that really helped me along early on, and then I started exploring more into various types of books because of the ease of use. I was always very hyper and fidgety growing up, so I could climb a tree and listen to an audiobook at the same time, which is how I first read Gulliver's Travels, was up in a tree, and it was just a great experience. And that book I just reread that recently, and it's just still magical to me. It brings me back to that moment, and then I started delving into Stephen King via a lot of the cassettes that our library had, and moved on from there. So audiobooks are hot, and I am supposed to be going faster, so let's move on to B. Bildungsroman.
Bildungsroman.
A fancy way, and first of all, people have a hard time saying bibliophagy, which, understandable, it's not a word we hear often. It's just biblio, books, phagy, consuming books, that's just a word. I think it's less of a mental image to me than bibliophiles. Anyway, Bildungsroman is basically dealing with someone's formative years or spiritual education, basically a coming-of-age story, and I think those are hot. Those are... When you think of a coming-of-age story, you have a lot of two things, and they're both necessary components of drama. One is conflict. There's always a lot of conflict in your formative years. It's kind of how you go back and think, a lot of people think of high school as the best time of their lives, even if that is a sad statement, but that's because there was a lot of conflict and a lot of growth there, and growth is the other necessary component. So both of those things are key to a good story, and often with a coming-of-age story, you have both of those in spades. And also, oftentimes with the coming-of-age story, you get a dollop of nostalgia, which is something that I like to experience. I think it's something about my generation particularly loves nostalgia. So we get nostalgic about all sorts of things. Recently I just got a bunch of McDonald's toys from 1994, I think, and my wife and I are like, oh, I remember having these and I love these. And now my son's really big into it, and that's just makes the experience good for me. So, like, taking that back into reading, like, you know, nostalgia, like Ready Player One. That book is primarily based on nostalgic purposes, but it's also a coming-of-age story for that character. Happens in that sort of adolescent time period, and that's what makes the book really fun for me. So,
Bildungsroman
is hot. C is children's books. This one's hard because I'm reading a lot of them, but I'm going to say not. It's not something I would seek out and read on my own, though they are very important and I loved them growing up. Things like Choose Your Own Adventures and books like Goosebumps and whatnot were very formative to me. I'm still reading them now. I don't count them as part of my reading. That would make the Read What You Own challenge really easy because I'm reading a lot of those out loud with my kid at night. And I do like how, like, when a book is really good in that age bracket, and you're like, all right, we're done with that chapter for tonight, and they're like, no, please. So they are magical, but they don't excite me anymore. There's just too much out there that's a little more complex, which I enjoy more. I mean, I don't dislike them. I wouldn't put them at not completely, more of a middling ground, but I don't seek them out for myself, so I'm going to say not. D is digital, so digital books. So I'm assuming they're not just talking about an audio file, but they're also talking about like ebooks and Kindle books and stuff. And I'm going to say hot to that as well. It's something I'm using more and more often, especially for like big fat tomes. You can get usually dirt cheap or free, and you can adjust the font however you like it. I'm currently exploring a font made for like people with dyslexia, and I'm finding it really helpful for myself. So, like, just having those options at my fingertips on a lightweight package, I can't really say anything other than it's hot. Next is experimental, and I don't really know exactly what is considered an experimental book, other than things like the book Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, or something like House of Leaves. I'm going to say hot. But with a caveat. With an experimental book, it really needs to hit a home run. That's what you're doing when you're doing an experimental book. You are swinging for the fences. So if it doesn't land, you're going to strike out and strike out bad. And your form is going to be awful, and you're not going to be able to recover from it. But if you do hit it, you hit it really solidly. In those examples, I don't think Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close really did that. And I haven't finished House of Leaves yet, but I have seen some books, a lot of them are just not coming to mind, where I'm like, well, that was different, but it was different in such a way that it made the experience really enjoyable. So, again, it's more middling, but I'm going to lean towards hot, because when it's done well, it's done well. The next is fantasy, hot. Big genre for me, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. The Hobbit is probably my favorite book, not the best book I've ever read, but my favorite. There's something comforting about it. I just like fantasy. It has a lot of the tropes that make a good story, usually a lot of like questing and stuff, which we may get to later on this list, but things that just have inherent drama. Yes, you can get a lot of lazy fantasy. It's going to happen, but I can't judge everything based on the sheer volume of bad examples of it, if that makes sense. Like, there's a lot of bad science fiction, there's a lot of bad fantasy, but when it's good, it's good. Next is graphic novels, and I'm going to say hot. I haven't really gotten big into comics until recently again, but growing up, I was really big into manga, and that was what I preferred over American comics, just because I had a hard time penetrating into American comics in like the middle of the story. They tended to just rely on way too much backstory, and there was never really a really good entry point for me, whereas a manga is usually more self-contained and linear and doesn't branch off in 1,000 directions. So I have a lot of manga volumes. I read a lot of manga volumes. That's kind of what I prefer for a graphic novel, But recently, with the excitement of other booktubers about the comics they grew up with, I've gone back and revisited them, and I do think that the graphic novel has a lot to offer. A lot of times, the stories are a little weak overall, but again, when it's really good, it's good. And I'm not going to punish the format just for the writers who sometimes get lazy in it. Next is H. H is for horror. And horror, excuse me, one moment, sorry. Horror is one of my favorite genres. Something about it, I think it's because as a child I grew up as a complete and utter coward, and yet still fascinated by horror, and that's probably like the sweet spot. I think my son is currently getting into a lot of like the pulpy style horror that I used to get into, so I recently got a Blu-ray of all the original Are You Afraid of the Darks, and he's been going through that, and night times are now like sometimes a joint venture where suddenly there's a young child in my bed, but like just the exposure to the horror, he's so into it just like I was, and it's sort of rekindling the magic for me as well. It's basically, horror has always been kind of pulpy and really fun, and sometimes, we need to feel slightly unsettled just to, build up a bulwark for the real world. So, horror is wonderful, I think. A lot of it can be done badly, again, but even that, it can still be really fun. So, I'm going to say hot for horror. I for inspirational. No, that is not. That is cold as cold can be. Inspirational fiction. If you're going to try to inspire me, you can do it without dedicating everything in the book to being inspirational. A lot of it, inspirational stuff, is either like nonfiction that is sort of, I don't know how to say it. It's sort of, there's a lot of spinning going on to make it like, well, things aren't all so bad, but it just seems very pandering, and I don't like inspirational fiction. That isn't to say I don't like religious fiction or religious texts, which I find fascinating, but inspiration tends to be on like the lighter side and the fluffy side, and I don't really want any more chicken soup to inspire me. I'll just have chicken. So, inspiration is a not. J is for journalism, and I'm going to be a little controversial in saying not, though it is very important. I think what gets in the way of journalism for me is journalists, and the best journalism is journalism that you can look at in hindsight, because most journalists don't look at the world accurately, and it's very frustrating for me. So I often don't keep up with modern journalism just because it's irritating and it flip-flops all around. Especially, I feel like it's probably worse now, though that just might be me being in it at the moment. It feels like everyone's in such a rush to get the story out that they don't vet anything, it seems, anyway. And then you don't get the full story until later when everyone looks back in retrospect and says, oh, this is how it really happened. Even though that could take years, and journalism can't really wait for that. I realize that, but it's also what frustrates me about it and why I'm going to put it in the not category. K is for kitsch, and this is described as having a popular or sentimental appeal, but it also like tacky and lowbrow. And I really like tacky things. Like in my office, I had this just on my desk for the longest period of time, and people were like, "Oh, are you a hunter?" I'm like, "No." This was like an heirloom. My grandfather found a deer that was hit by a car and decided to clean up its skeleton because why not? So it has sentimental purpose to me, but I realize it's also not like a manifestation of my personality. It's just I liked having it there as like an odd little trinket. I'm like a magpie. I like odd little trinkets, and it doesn't always like cohese together as a whole. So how does this translate into fiction or books in general? And I would say that things like oh, what's it called? Meddling Kids. That was a book where it was basically pastiches of the Scooby Gang getting put together in like a modern situation and with like a Lovecraftian spin. That's pretty tacky, and yet I had a great time with a book like that. Tacky has to be done well, and I don't think it I think it's just like something you throw at the wall and see what sticks. It's not going to appeal to you like every time, but when it hits and like you're like, I get it, I like it. Let's see what we can do with that. It's just like a sense of whimsy and fun. I enjoy it, even though it is very lowbrow. I understand, but I'm still having a great time. So Kitsch is hot. L's for library, and for years my roommate was a librarian, and if I did not say that libraries were hot, I would wake up with a horse head in my bed, and she still knows where I live, so I'm going to say hot. Libraries are good. I make use of mine all the time, and I'm part of multiple library systems, which really helps for the audiobooks, especially now that we have like the Libby app and other apps too. So libraries are hot. M is for mystery. I'm going to say not, but I'm mainly saying mystery is a not, mostly in the purest form of the genre. I'm trying to change this around, but like at the moment, mysteries in and of themselves don't really appeal to me unless there's some other spin to it. So if I'm trying to brute force my way through that because there's a lot of good stories in the mystery genre, but I think I'm slightly against it due to my love of horror, and so many books started with like a horrific element. With a horrific element. And then, like, the mystery happened, and then the investigation happened, and it turns out there was nothing supernatural at all. And I think, as a kid, that really annoyed me a lot. And so, like, I'm like, if there's a spooky mystery, a lot of times, like, it was something that wasn't supernatural at all. Which makes no sense, because I love Scooby-Doo. Going back to that, and that was, like, the foundation was, like, this isn't, like, a real monster at all, but for whatever reason it works there. It's probably the delivery. Whereas in a mystery novel, now if it's like a Lovecraftian like mystery where people are discovering the supernatural element and trying to deal with it that way, like sort of an occult detective thing, I love it. So that's a hot, but like mysteries as the genre itself is probably a not for me, and I am sad about that. N is for nonfiction, and that is hot. I love nonfiction, especially histories and biographies. Excuse me. And enough said, I've really gotten into them over the past few years. It's not something that's always been hot to me, but the world is fascinating, and my biggest problem with nonfiction is I never know where to start or finish, so I just like dive into hyper-specific periods and trying to like come up with a cohesive whole, which kind of works, but there's just so much out there, and I get overwhelmed by it. But overall, hot. I want to know how the world works. O is for Omnibus, and that's just a collection of stories or books. I'm going to say hot, though they can get unwieldy at times. I really, really like omnibuses for comics, because I hate having like floppy comics just lying around. They get destroyed at my house. Like, there's no way around it. So if I want to like have a comic collection, I want like graphic novel collections in a big old fat omnibuses. They are unwieldy. This also applies to like short story collections. I don't know if they're considered an omnibus. I kind of put them in the same category. Like the Auto Penciler Big Book series. Those are great. It's better than having a bunch of floppy magazines lying around. Novel omnibuses where it's like 5 in 1. It's a good deal. But I almost never like go to them to read the novels. I think there's like diminishing returns there, and I just have them as like placeholders in my collection until I can get like a set of them. But then again, I traded in all of the Amber books I had for the Big Book of Amber, so maybe I'm okay with it. I don't know. I'm gonna read that in January, so we'll find out. But overall, I want to say hot because I just compulsively buy them. Next is P for poetry, and that's a not for me. I just don't understand it. That's all there's to it. I tried to power my way through it. I understand like classic poetry, where you're like limited to structure and form, and I understand that. And like that's almost like a little Sudoku puzzle where you're trying to like fit the theme of your poem in a specific form, and like that takes art and skill, and I like seeing that. So I like that, but most poetry nowadays is just like what I consider like free poetry or modern poetry, and I just don't like it at all. Half the time, I think the appeal is you're supposed to like decode it yourself and come up with your own meaning, which I think is stupid if you're trying to say something. I had a bunch of poetry classes in college, and while I wrote some poems that I just tried to play to like the teacher's tastes, and so like oftentimes I would get A's on them. I'm like, this is garbage. Like I don't really understand the point of speaking poetically. Maybe I just have like a deaf ear to like the rhythm of the words or something. I don't pretend it's not like a deficiency in me. I just wish someone could explain poetry to me in a way that would make me understand. Be like, oh yes, there are poems I like. I like symbolism and like evocations of feeling, but like I totally just don't understand poetry in general. So that's a not for me, unfortunately. Q is for quests, and that is when the protagonist goes on a quest, or that is either physical or spiritual. And I'm going to say hot. Again, this goes back to me loving fantasy a lot. You'll see it a lot in fantasy, but it's all over the place. Just having like a MacGuffin to go towards. It's also really big in pulps, now that I think about it. Like a doomsday machine. We have to stop it. Well, that's a quest. Great, a lot of fun. So I love quests. R is for romance, and I'm going to have to say not as a genre again. Kind of like with mystery, I don't mind it in a book as like a supplemental feature, but I don't seek out romance books. I'm wondering if it's just me not exposing myself to them, to be honest. I don't really like erotica, I know that. And like there's better ways to get your jollies, I think. But romance itself, like most of the time is when I encounter it, it's things that could be so easily resolved if people were just to communicate. And so it just gets frustrating for me when they're not communicating. That's why I don't like a lot of rom-coms too, unless they're particularly like witty. They just don't do it for me. So I'm going to have to say no to romance, but I'm not against romance. I just don't. It doesn't do anything for me. S is science fiction. Yes, that's hot. It's one of the main genres that got me into reading. Again, Star Trek fiction is how it started, and then like anything speculative. I'm really still drawn to like the older classic science fiction. Maybe because those are almost more like fantasies than they were science fiction. A little less hard science fiction. And it's just like, we're going on an adventure! Yay! So, with laser guns. So, I like science fiction a lot. T is for translation. Books translated from one language into another. I don't seek them out, but hot, I'm glad they do it. Some of my favorite authors, like Italo Calvino, like, I don't speak Italian. I would never get... I know myself well enough to know that I'll never try to learn another language just to read a book. Languages don't come easily to me unless I'm like fully immersed in the culture, and I don't travel anymore. It's just too difficult. So books and translations sort of get you into another culture's mindset a little bit easier, and I do like experiencing other cultures. It's just more of like I don't want to leave my bunker to go out and go to another country. It seems like a lot of work for like very little return, except it's not. I've been all sorts of places. But like for me, like I have a hard time just leaving the house. So translation is great. I get to experience stuff I wouldn't normally get to. U is for Übermensch, and that's superhuman or extraordinary human. Characters who can do anything. And I'm actually going to say hot. A lot of people don't like Mary Sue characters, but excuse me. One thing Mary Sue characters have is competence. And I really enjoy watching someone who's competent. Like, for an example, like in television, we have Dexter from the show Dexter. He's highly competent, and he gets away with things that he shouldn't get away with. And it's fun to watch just because I like watching someone who's good at something. Maybe it just helps me project into their shoes and be like, oh yes, I could be good too. I can be talented, and maybe I shouldn't be using Dexter as an example for like projecting myself into. But I like watching competent characters do things competently, and then coming up with something that they're not normally used to dealing with. Like, if there's no drama, I don't like it. But that's just bad writing. So I like having an Übermensch and then something that can foil the Übermensch, if that makes sense. Next is V, Victorian literature. Literature from 1837 to 1901. I'm going to actually say not. I don't have anything against it. I just don't have a whole lot of exposure other than like the Dickens and whatnot. I have nothing against it. There's a lot of good stories in it, but I don't seek it out. So if it's not turning up the burners for me, then I'm going to have to say not. W is for Western. It's a tough one, because I didn't read Westerns until recently, but when I have, I really enjoyed them. So I'm going to say hot. Going back to like Q for quest, a lot of Westerns do have quests. They're just basically a reskin of fantasy or some other genre when you really think about it. And sometimes a lot of science fiction is also like uses Western tropes. When you think of The Mandalorian, for instance. So I'm going to say hot. This is something new for me. I haven't started reading Westerns until we had the BookTube event, June on the Range. And that's where like a whole new genre opened up for me. So, hot. X is for X-rated, and I'm going to say not. Again, I think I mentioned this before. I have better ways of appealing to that nature. I don't particularly get much out of hot, steamy fiction. I can have hot and steamy in my fiction and be perfectly content with that amount. But like a whole book that's X-rated, it's probably not going to be well written, and it's I don't know. Maybe if someone can give me some good examples of things that are like extraordinary, but most of the time I think it's just mostly trash, and not trash in a good way. So I'm going to say not for that. Y, young adult. I'm also going to say not. There are some really good young adult books, but the majority of them don't do it for me. And it's probably because they seem so formulaic at this point, which is dumb because that really does apply to fantasy and science fiction and whatnot, but for whatever reason, I'm just not drawn to YA books, and if I am excited to hear about a book and then find out it's a YA, I will tend to hesitate. So I'm going to have to say not. And Z, Zeitgeist, the spirit or mood of the times. And I'm going to say hot, but I don't want to read anything about the current zeitgeist. Like, no. I don't want to hear about my time. But I'm fascinated by other time periods zeitgeist. So if you go back like 50 years, 70 years, 100 years, like, I'm fascinated. I want to know what your daily life was like, what your thoughts were, what the political situation was. I want to hear it all, and I want it in stories. You usually get that from like if you read old books, you usually get like just those details like just thrown in that you normally wouldn't get from like a history book. I was just reading a mystery story that was talking about like should we get a refrigerator? Well, why when we have this perfectly good like what's it called? What's that cupboard called? Larder. There we go. Why should we get a fridge? We have a perfectly good larder. And then I'm like going online and be like, how does a larder even work? Like, how does that preserve food? It really doesn't. So like stuff like that just sprinkled in, like, gives me a sense of the spirit of the time, and I find that fascinating. And that's why I'm going with hot. But like modern Zeitgeist, no, I don't want that. I got that. And that was a big problem with Holly for me, the Stephen King book. Like, it was just really not that interesting COVID talk throughout most of it, and I just didn't care. So that's it. At this point, this tag has been going around for a couple months now, so I think anyone who wanted to do it has already done it, so I'm not going to tag anybody. But if you haven't, and you're seeing this, and you want to join in, please do. And stick me in the comments so I'll know to watch it. Beyond that, you guys have a great Tuesday, and I will talk to you later. Bye.